Hi, today I'd like to talk about how we handle our electrical systems in our home studios, especially as it relates to the rest of the house. I think when we're laying out our studios and designing what's going to go where and everything, a lot of times people don't think about what kind of circuitry they have as far as their breakers are concerned and where they're going to plug stuff in. So that's the primary focus of today's video. One thing I did just want to mention as far as like surge protection and things like that, we'll hit into some of that. But as far as taking care of your studio gear, one thing I just did want to touch on briefly was when you're not using things, cover them up. I just used some black fabric here, and I think that's something we should all do. I mainly play guitar, and I may not touch my keyboards for a while, so I try to keep that covered up when I'm not using them, because that might be, several weeks before I get back to playing on the keyboards. But the rest of the equipment, in general, you should keep it covered somehow just to keep the dust off. Okay, the mixer, recorder, and then this is the main studio mixer for the house sound. All right, so most of us have like a big collection of, say, amplifiers like on that side, and I've got the main recording console over here where I do most of my work. And then finally we got the keyboard area there, and as I keep panning around, we got some more guitars and things in my elbow, and I've got some more amps and things over here. All right, so we've got a lot of electronics in here, and when you're working with all this stuff, it's like, well, I want to take care of it. If there's any electrical storms or anything, how is that going to fit into the big picture, and how do I make sure a surge isn't going to get me? Okay. So to get started, I wanted to show you how I laid out the electrical service inside the studio itself. This is just a 3D rendering of what the outlet boxes and switches and stuff look like. So if we look up here, we got the circuit breaker box, okay? And so when I designed the studio, I wanted to make sure I had a minimum of 2 different circuit breakers handling that room, because one is, it's a sealed room, no windows or anything, so if you're working in there and you have to turn off one circuit, then you don't have any light. So this way you'd always have at least one circuit on to work in there, and you'd have access to power and light. That's one advantage to splitting it up like this. But you'll notice I have red and yellow outlets. That's what these little squares are on the wall. Red one over here is an outlet, and that's for one circuit. The yellow over here is a switch, okay, and it handles the overhead lights, okay. And the red is another thing on the same circuit as the other red. And then these 2 yellows are in the same circuit as the yellow across the way there. So let's look at the circuits in general and see how they are laid out. So the red ones, I'm going to call them circuit 1. All right, so they're dedicated, as you'll see, to just my electronic equipment for the studio. So that includes amplifiers, the mixer, the power amps, the DAW and everything. So even the computer and my pedals, everything works off these 2 outlets. It's the same circuit. It's a 15 amp circuit. And so that's the goal, is you want to make sure you don't overload your circuit when you're doing something like this. The other circuit is what's called circuit 2. And so I've got that set up for the overhead lights. And let's switch to the next view here. We've got the other outlets on the other side of the wall. So I've got one over here by the keyboards, but that's not what I plug the keyboards into. That's just for more auxiliary electronics, whether it's a vacuum cleaner or some other lighting or something like that. But it keeps that circuit isolated from my circuit 1, which is all the equipment. I've got another C2 over here outlet, and that's more for the shop area, which I didn't show a picture of the shop area, but that's on this side of the studio here, and it's a workbench. Okay. Okay, so the way I've done this is I try to put the balance of load throughout for the various surge protectors. So I have a Furman over here. I've got a thing called a Trond, I think it is, off Amazon, that I have some equipment into, and I've got another surge protector for my pedal board. And because I need a lot of outlets, I've got several surge protectors, but you cannot stack surge protectors. So some people, in fact, early on, I even had, this is the first in line, and I daisy chained a second surge protector for the keyboard area. And then after doing a little more research, it's like, well, that's not safe. So I had to come up with a different system to split out what got plugged into what. So I had enough plugs and enough surge protection and enough power for everything. So what I've done is I've got one plug here, all right? And this plug goes to in this case, it's a 3-way, but you can get these off. I had to switch up my lights a little bit, but I use these, I'm not sure what you call it. It's just like a it's not really an extension cord, but it's a way to split out your plug. So So you can plug in things that have a longer extension cable on them. So like the Furman has like an 8-foot cable. The Trond over here is got like a, I don't know, 20-foot cable or something ridiculous. And this other one for the pedal board has like another, 6-foot or whatever foot power cord on it. So what this does then is, even though when you're going into one outlet, it sends however much electricity you need to each one, but you're not, for one thing, you're not going to overload the circuit, making sure you understand how many amps each item is pulling, and make sure, one, that your outlet can handle it, but also that the individual surge protectors can handle it. So what this allows me to do, and this is one of the things I really like about doing this system, is, well, one thing is I've got this separated from fans and lighting and all the other stuff in this room, or the rest of the house for that matter, because it's on a different circuit. But this is actually my primary 100% guaranteed surge protector. If there's a storm coming up or something, all I have to do is come in and unplug this one cable, and that basically nothing is connected to power at that point, to the power lines. So we've had some lightning strikes on houses around here, and they have caused havoc with some other things in our house, a lot of routers and some clocks and things like that. I think a couple TV sets over the years. So I was very sensitive about making sure I had surge protection. And so not only for just like the little blips and things you get throughout the day, construction work or whatever might happen in your area, but also for, a major thunderstorm, just some, if you just this way, you're just unplugging the one plug, at least for this side, and that takes care of all your equipment. So if you have a couple dollars, invested in this stuff, and you want to make sure that, it doesn't get blown out. All right. And so likewise, after things have settled down, to get everything up and running again, all you have to do is put that in there. So here what I've got is the same thing. I've got all my amplifiers will go through one plug here. Now, I will say that, yes, if you turned on all the amplifiers at once, and we'll look at those load ratings and what that looks like for the total circuit. So you just need to make sure you understand what the output of all these devices are. But on the power amps, generally, you wouldn't be pulling that much for an individual amp. And for my purposes, I wouldn't be using no more than 2 amps at a time if I wanted something stereo. But generally, I would just be using one amplifier at a time. But again, if I want to get things going, you plug it in, and then all my amplifiers and everything should have access to power. Okay. Whoops, I didn't take let's see how to keep that covered. All right, so over here then, so back here, and I'll point it out because you may not be able to see it that well, but this is one of those Trond surge protectors. I hope I'm saying that right. It's all black and their logo is really dark, so I'll have to look up, make sure I'm saying the right thing. These are nice because it's got a lot of surge protection, whatever the rating is. These are nice because they also have the USB outlets on them. That's something that you're just kind of starting to see now. So on these, I do a double whammy. I do both the plug and unplug it, but also there's a switch on these things. I leave that turned off as well. I wouldn't have to, but I just do anyway. Okay, so this one plug then handles an awful lot. And so like I said, you want to be sure that you're not overloading your circuit with that. So I've got a champ, an Ashdown bass amp, Ignator. There's a silver tone up in that box up there. Those are just speakers. And then on the other side, there's my workbench. Get some light over here. And then on this side, I've got a PV and an Excelsior amp as well. Okay. Now in this case, I've actually run an extension cord behind the fireproof box there, but that's an extension strip outlet. Okay. It does not have power, does not have surge protection on it, but you can't see it back there. But what that does, and allows it to all run off that same surge protector for the amplifier. So all the amplifiers go through the one outlet. And if you turn all the amps on, you might possibly overload the circuit. I think the amps don't really draw maximum amps drawing amps. The amplifiers don't draw their maximum amps until you would max out the amp. And for one thing, I would never do that in here. That's just too freaking loud. For any single 2 amps at a time, it has zero problems handling that. Okay. Okay, and the other thing I was mentioning before was tracking how much power you've got going to each center, I'll call it, and what's the total load on your circuit. So let me just show real quick, since we're standing right here. My circuit breaker is in the room here, and behind this Fender amp speaker cover. So the circuit breaker, I added an extra breaker specifically for the studio. So I've got, in here it's labeled 3 and 9 are the two circuits, but I've actually got the things labeled, the outlets labeled 3 and 9, so there's no question about which thing I'm plugging into. So I went through, I was inventorying everything. I was doing actually a cost estimate, how much I've spent on everything. We won't talk about that. But in the process, I was writing down how many watts things were using. Looking at the labels, usually it's watts and or amps are listed on the product label on the thing itself. So the best I could do is get either watts, or sometimes it was only watts. Usually there's be both watts and amps, or amps as well. So what I found was on this circuit, it was just under 1,000 watts, okay, 956 watts based on the equipment I've got. And that'll change over time, so as you swap stuff out, pedal doesn't use too much. Pedals are about, I've got between 5 and 12, 5 and 12 watts, so they don't use a lot. And the same thing with amperage, they don't use a lot. They're just a couple amps each, milliamps each, so they don't use much there. You can do that simple calculation with that law that, Ohm's law, I guess it is, to figure out how many amps it is if all you have is wattage. But anyway, so I came up with the amps on this. So this side here, this circuit has a total of 8 amps. And so this thing is probably going to be, of the two outlets I'm using here, this one will probably be more likely to be hitting 8 at any given time, or close to it, or basically it's not going over 8, so that's the maximum. But I would be turning all this stuff on, especially the keyboards at some point. So all the other amps and the Model 12, the workstation, and all that stuff could be on at some point at the same time. But that's all coming out of that one plug. Now this other plug that I talked about over here, the plug that was back here then, that's for all the amplifiers. Now that one's actually runs a pretty, so looking at the wattage of all these things, like the PV course is about 400 watts. The bass amp, the Ashdown bass amp was 250, Ignitor's 150, the Vibrochamp is 60 watts. So anyway, if you convert all these things over to amps, you end up with all the amplifiers, if they're on at the same time, drawing maximum power, would be 8.7. Okay, so what you'll notice then is that's almost 17 amps if everything's going at once, and that's going to overload your circuit, okay? Overload the circuit breaker. So keep that in mind. You don't want to overload the circuit breaker, so you just have to be aware you can't turn everything on at the same time. You can keep everything plugged in, but like I said, chances are you're only going to be using 1 or 2 amps at a time. The rest of the electronics, compressors, outboard gear, all that stuff, it doesn't take that much power. Now, one thing you might have, which I don't have a huge PC set up here. It's actually it's a Athlon. It's like it's really small. It's like a 1300G or something like that. Works great for what I use it for YouTube videos and learning, getting some lessons online and everything. But that's a very small processor, doesn't draw much power at all. So if you had a big, huge workstation, like I do in my office, then you might be concerned about how much that's pulling, because that could be pulling 500 to 1,000 watts, depending on how new your system is and what you've got into it and everything. That might be a consideration for some people. Okay, if you look over here, I'll turn this light up so you can see it. So this is that other circuit I was talking about before. This is the one that's just for house lighting and things like that. I've got like the router and the security system. All that stuff goes into this number 9, circuit 9 outlet. So it's separate from the rest of the studio. But here's the Tron, and that's the second one that goes back to that 3-way plug I was showing you before, okay? But when you see this outlet here, that's being used for non-studio stuff, basically. Well, non-recording stuff. Okay, you might think that it's kind of hard to deal with this as far as booting everything up, but let me just go through and just show you what a startup procedure would look like, okay? We already turned the amps on over here, so we don't have to worry about that, but you just saw it was basically, if it's plugged in, you're just going to hit that surge protector. Over here, it's going to be something similar, so we'll do this. Well, first thing we do, since it's plugged in, all we have to do is start turning on these surge protectors. So over here we've got the Furman. Turn that on. That turns on the power amp and then everything else over here. Now I generally leave my preamp off unless I'm actually going to use it. Some of this equipment I don't like turning on unless I'm actively recording something. So like the preamp and my compressor. So I changed settings. And the compressor would generally stay off well, as in also the parametric EQ, but I generally wouldn't use those on a daily basis. If I'm recording, I would, but anytime I'm playing with the workstation. Okay, so that's workstation's ready to go. Okay, and then if I'm going to do the keyboards, okay, so to walk through and turn everything on, it really doesn't take that long. The same thing with the pedal board down here. And so it has its own power down here too, which I didn't really show you that. But that's the same thing. Everything runs off. There you go. And that boots up. Turns on a little light and then it powers up the pedal board. So with that one power, with the one plug, then I've got everything plugged in. Everything's turned on. And basically I just turned on 3 power strips. So everything's got surge protection on a day-to-day basis. All right. And then when I want to do total protection, all I got to do is I'm going to shut down at the end of the session anyway, is in everything's shut down, the storm's coming up, then I just got to walk over and pull out the plug, the one plug, and then everything is 100% protected from surges. Okay, and the same thing over here on the amplifier side. Okay, so that's about all I really wanted to say about this today. I was just thinking how long it kind of took me to figure this out and to reduce the amount of unplugging and plugging back in and everything. So basically everything's has a plug somewhere. It has a home. Everything's protected. So that's the main purpose of this video. So if you have any questions or comments, please let me know in the comments section below. I appreciate you watching this. Please consider subscribing. If you like the content and maybe learn something, give me a thumbs up. So I'd like to thank you very much for watching.